West Side Story is a 1957 musical conceived and choreographed by Jerome Robbins, with a book by Arthur Lawrence and music by Leonard Bernstein, lyrics by the incomparable Stephen Sondheim in his Broadway debut. It was nominated for 6 Tonys and won 2, including Best Choreography for Jerome Robbins, but it notably lost Outstanding Musical to The Music Man. West Side Story is also a 1961 film directed by Robert Wise and Jerome Robbins from a screenplay by Ernest Lehman, adapted, obviously, from the 1957 musical. It was the highest-grossing film of 1961, was nominated for 11 Oscars, and won 10, including Best Picture. Fun fact, it's actually the only movie to ever win exactly 10 Oscars. 3 movies have won 11, 3 movies have won 9, but only West Side Story has won 10. It is considered by many to be among the Best Picture winners. And for an awful lot of people, both the show and the 1961 movie adaptation are beloved and untouchable. The show was their introduction to not only Stephen Sondheim, but also to musicals in general. And the movie redefined what a movie musical could be and is a constant rewatchable. I am not one of those people. I saw the movie once when I was like 23, and I thought it was pretty good, but I've just never been one for musicals. And I think any discussion of the 2021 Spielberg version should begin with that disclaimer or caveat, because your personal history or lack thereof with the original text is in all likelihood going to color how you feel about this. And I have little to no personal history. All that said, I fucking loved this. I loved it. It's so good. Even though I didn't have much of a relationship with the original movie, I still had tepidly high expectations for this. For one, Spielberg. Yeah, even though the last 15 or so years of his movies have been a little hit or miss, open parentheses, all caps, by the standards of his filmography, close parentheses, it's still Spielberg. For two, it was written by the great Tony Kushner, Pulitzer Prize winner and screenwriter of the 2 best Spielberg movies in that 15 or so year stretch. And even with my tepidly high expectations, I kind of can't believe how good this is. If you're completely unfamiliar with the show or movie, it's a modern day Romeo and Juliet. Or, Romeo and Juliet in the 1950s. And I don't just mean it's 2 young people who fall in love under difficult circumstances, evoking Romeo and Juliet. It was originally conceived specifically as a Romeo and Juliet adaptation. But instead of the Capulets and the Montagues, we have the Sharks, a Puerto Rican street gang, and the Jets, a white street gang. That's uncomfy to say out loud. The movie opens like its predecessor with a mostly dialogueless prologue, where the Sharks and Jets have a little tussle, but it's broken up by the cops before things get too heated. This lack of resolution inspires the Jets leader Riff, played brilliantly by Mike Faist, to get the war councils together with his Sharks counterpart Bernardo, played by David Alvarez, and schedule a real rumble with the Sharks. Winner take all for the turf they've been fighting over. Riff seeks the support of his oldest friend and Jets co-founder, Tony, played by Ansel Elgort, but Tony is reluctant to go to the dance where the war council is to take place because he's trying to keep his nose clean for his parole officer and seems ready to leave a life of rumbles and turf wars behind him. Cut to Bernardo's apartment, where we meet his little sister, Maria, played by Rachel Zegler, as she gets ready for the dance with Bernardo's girlfriend, Anita, played wonderfully by Ariana DeBose. Tony ends up going to the dance, he and Maria have their star-crossed lovers meeting, and Riff and Bernardo plan the rumble for the next night. From there, Tony and Maria fall in love very quickly. Their relationship is threatened by the ongoing conflict among the other people in their lives. Stakes are raised to deadly levels once the rumble actually takes place, and Romeo and Juliet. So if you watch interviews, Steven Spielberg makes a point to say that this is an adaptation of the 1957 show, implying he's not remaking the 61 movie, but adapting the 57 show. I've never seen the show, so I don't even know if that's a meaningful distinction, but it's a distinction he's making. But that brings up the question. When a movie version of the 57 show already exists, and it was pretty much as successful as any movie can hope to be by most every metric, why make it again 60 years later? The short answer is simple. Spielberg. We'll get to him in a bit, but the longer answer is that as successful as the 61 movie was, there are definitely some aspects that are ripe for update, aesthetically, dramatically, and thematically. The aesthetics of the 61 movie are probably in the most apparent need for update in the 21st century. For one, they used makeup to darken the skin of all the Puerto Rican characters, and it's like caked on there, especially for George Chakiris as Bernardo. Now, I don't have time to unpack why they would darken the skin of the Puerto Rican characters, or why it really sucks they decided to do that, but just on a pure aesthetic level, it's ugly, distracting, and doesn't hold up at all to the scrutiny of high definition, to say nothing of 21st century sensibilities about race. Speaking of which, maybe the most infamous aspect of the 61 movie was the casting of the late Natalie Wood as Maria. I'm certainly not the arbiter of who's allowed to play what. You know, David Alvarez is of Cuban descent, playing a Puerto Rican character. Rachel Zegler is of Colombian descent, playing a Puerto Rican character. Is that okay? Is that close enough? Probably, but that's not really for me to say. However, to have Natalie Wood, whose parents were Russian immigrants, play your Puerto Rican Juliet, that's certainly a choice. I don't know, I guess it'd be one thing if Natalie Wood gave like an exceptional performance, but all due respect, she didn't. She's not very good as Maria. Also, she didn't even sing. They ultimately dubbed her singing with Marni Nixon without telling her. So this casting of Natalie Wood, why?
You did this for what?
Richard Beymer isn't very good as Tony either. Not entirely either actor's fault. Tony and Maria are just pretty bland characters in the 61 movie. That was my take after seeing it 9 years ago. Anita rules, Bernardo's pretty cool, Tony and Maria are boring as shit. I later learned that's a pretty common, if not standard, take. To boot, Rita Moreno as Anita and George Chakiris as Bernardo both won Oscars in their respective supporting categories, and Natalie Wood and Richard Beymer were not even nominated. I think it's telling that a movie that won 10 Oscars, including 2 acting Oscars, was not even nominated for its lead performances. Which segues nicely into the dramatic updates of the new movie. On the Blank Check podcast episode on West Side Story, host Griffin Newman reads from Roger Ebert's years later review of the 61 movie, in which Ebert says, West Side Story remains a landmark of musical history. But if the drama had been as edgy as the choreography, if the lead performances matched Moreno's fierce concentration, if the gags had been more dangerous and less like bad boy Archies and Jugheads, if the ending had delivered on the pathos and tragedy of the original, there's no telling what might have resulted. The hosts then point out, that might as well be a checklist for everything the 2021 version does. Now there is telling what might have resulted. This. Honestly, I think a lot of this comes down to the casting and performance of Rachel Zegler as Maria. Yes, Ebert specifically mentions the lead characters, as did I, but if the drama had been as edgy as the choreography, the drama is certainly improved because the lead characters are improved. If the ending had delivered on the pathos and tragedy of the original. The ending is immensely improved when you actually give a shit about these two people. When Maria, Tony, and Chino all converge for the movie's final moments, I heard gasps in the theater audience. So, Ansel Elgort as Tony is fine. He's good in the scenes where he needs to be good, and he's certainly better than Richard Beymer. Tony just isn't a very interestingly written character, and it's my understanding that's kind of always been an issue with any adaptation or revival of West Side Story. As far as this version goes, to those familiar with the story, I think he's good in the post-Rumble stuff, which is very important, but I don't really buy his performance as much during the Rumble, when he does the thing that Tony does. On the other hand, Rachel Zegler is an absolute revelation. Yes, she can sing and she can dance, but I'm so impressed by how she carries the romantic scenes as well as the dramatic scenes. And how she can not only hold a close-up, but hold a close-up so well that it's used as the opening image of one of the most anticipated trailers of the year. So, production cast a wide net to find the leads. Casting director Cindy Tolan tweeted out an open casting call in 2018, and they got 35,000 submissions for the 4 lead roles, Maria, Tony, Anita, and Bernardo. And that is how Rachel Zegler, who's just a 17-year-old high school student in New Jersey, fresh off playing Fiona in her high school's production of Shrek the Musical, got cast as the lead in a Spielberg movie.
I responded to an open casting call that our casting director, Cindy Tolan, posted on Twitter, and my friend McKenna from California sent it to me with the caption, "Thank me when you're famous."
I knew going into this that she hadn't been in a movie before, but I don't think I knew the extent from which she was plucked from obscurity. Before this, her biggest claim to fame was going viral on Twitter for singing Shallow in an empty auditorium. And in this movie, within 2 minutes of her appearing on screen, you're just like, oh wow, that's a movie star. Good for her. And while that's all well and good, and it makes it easy to root for her and her career moving forward, I want to reiterate that she's really good in this. And for me, many of the improvements of this version over the 61 version fall largely onto her shoulders. That said, with all due respect to Rachel Zegler, I think the person most responsible for why I like this so much is, of course, Steven Spielberg. I've never made a movie, but I have been writing screenplays for a few years now, and it's kind of rewired my brain in how I watch movies. Depending on the movie and how many times I've seen it, sometimes I start to see the seams a little bit. After all, movies are just hundreds, if not thousands, of creative decisions. Every minute of screen time involves someone deciding where the scene should take place, what should be in the background, where the character should stand, where to put the camera, and there's always more than one way to skin a cat. And as I've rewatched Spielberg movies over the last few years, here's something I've become convinced of. There is no one alive, maybe no one who's ever lived, better at knowing where to put the camera than Steven Spielberg. A given scene can be staged 1,000 different ways, and whenever I watch the way Spielberg does it, 9 times out of 10, I think to myself, yeah, that was the right way to do it. No notes. He always knows exactly what to show, exactly what to withhold, exactly when to go to a close-up or an insert, exactly when and how to move the camera, exactly when and how to move characters within the frame. He's just on another level, the best to ever do it, and still an unbelievable joy to watch even in his 6th decade of doing it. Obviously, I'm not alone in that opinion. Spielberg is good is not a novel take, so a lot of people were very excited for Spielberg to finally make a musical. 32 feature films over 50 years, and he'd never made a musical before, outside of the opening sequence of Temple of Doom. It's such a visually rich genre with dancing and motion and scale and the potential for dazzling images. And this is a guy who, depending on your perspective, either invented, redefined, or perfected modern cinematic language. People were really excited to see what he would do. And what he did, to me, is magic. The opening is incredible. The gym scene is incredible. America is incredible. Just seeing dozens of people in colorful, flowy clothing dancing on either actual streets or incredible sets, it's just absolutely joyous. I don't know what to tell you.
I don't know what to tell you, bud.
But the magic isn't limited to the big, ostentatious musical numbers. The way he stages Tonight almost convinces you that these kids could fall in love in a single night. And at the very least, it's a massive improvement over the flat, nothing staging of the 1961 version. By the way, just to further illustrate how not into musicals I was as a kid, this song Tonight was definitely my first exposure to Stephen Sondheim in a Mountain Dew commercial. Tonight, there's only you tonight. And then there's images like this right before the rumble, with the sharks and jets approaching each other and their shadows meaningfully overlapping. I look at that and it's almost frustrating in a way, because it's such a striking and rich image to the point that it almost seems obvious, and yet I've never seen anyone do that before, so it can't be that obvious. And yet it just feels so right and instantly iconic. And that is the power of Spielberg's camera. And of course, shout out to his longtime cinematographer, Janusz Kaminski, Oscar nominated. But beyond the imagery and Kaminski's camera, Spielberg is just a master storyteller. He knows character, he knows drama, he knows setup and payoff. There are some, what I consider to be, storytelling fixes from the 1961 movie. For one, they changed the order of the musical numbers to reflect the 57 show, or so I've read, and I think the order works a lot better for the flow of the story. And changing the order of the songs allows them to make some changes to who sings the songs. Not sure if that part is just a reflection of the 57 show or if that's Spielberg and Kushner's doing, but again, some of these changes work so much better than the 61 version. And the storytelling improvements aren't limited to the musical numbers. There's a gun that factors into the third act, and in the 61 movie, it's just sort of said at one point, hey, watch out, so-and-so's got a gun. And in this version, not only is the gun introduced a lot earlier, so it's not as much of a deus ex machina, the manner in which it's introduced and the journey it takes to end up in so-and-so's hands in the third act is completely tragic and really effective. But perhaps the greatest stroke of genius in updating West Side Story is in the role of Doc. In the 61 movie, Doc owns the local drugstore in the neighborhood and employs Tony to stock shelves and sweep up. And he's a bit of a sad sack. He's an older guy who struggles to understand the young people around him and their turf wars, so he ends up reading a bit hapless. But in 2021 West Side Story, Doc has passed away and his store is run by his widow, Valentina, played by the great Rita Moreno, who, as a reminder, punched her O in her EGOT when she played Anita 60 years ago. By the way, in all likelihood, Ariana DeBose is also going to win an Oscar for playing Anita, so that's pretty cool. Valentina is not at all hapless like Doc. She's sharp, quick-witted, and doesn't take shit from anybody. But most importantly, she's warm, wise, and an empathetic mentor to Tony. Casting Rita Moreno as Valentina was crazy smart. And by the way, that wasn't even Spielberg or even Tony Kushner's idea. It was Kushner's husband, Mark Harris, a great writer in his own right. The first reason it's crazy smart is just because it allows Rita Moreno to be involved in your production. By all accounts, she was an enormously important presence on set, mentoring the relative newcomers and offering her thoughts on how they approach certain material. She was so important on set, in fact, that they ended up giving her producer credit on the movie. And that wasn't something they planned to do when they cast her, it was just a reflection of the work she ended up doing. The second reason it's crazy smart to cast Rita Moreno is the new dynamic that it introduces with Tony. A reminder that Tony is on parole, that's why he's not really in the Jets anymore. And in both versions of the movie, Doc/Valentina is doing him a pretty big solid by employing him and letting him get his life back together after spending a year in jail. But Doc was a white man and Valentina is a Puerto Rican woman. So the fact that Tony has this mentor-mentee relationship with a Puerto Rican woman, having been in the Jets and still associating with the Jets, is pretty loaded. Which segues nicely, finally, into the thematic updates of the new movie. The third reason it's smart to cast Rita Moreno is that her presence here is a distillation of possibly the main justification of the remake's existence. And that is, we've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go. Spielberg told the New York Times that Tony Kushner felt that West Side Story had very valuable things to contribute to our understanding of the consequences of racism, xenophobia, and poverty. He kept saying that this is going to be more relevant now than it was in 1957, and that turned out to be the case. Kushner worked on the script for 5+ years, which means from the time he started it to the time he finished it, racial tensions in the US got notably more pronounced in a number of ways. Suddenly, immigration from Spanish-speaking countries became one of the most hot-button political issues of the day, as did white grievance, which makes the conflict between the Sharks and the Jets as relevant as ever.
You know, I wake up to everything I know either getting sold or wrecked or being taken over by people that I don't like. And they don't like me.
Now tell me that doesn't sound like a direct quote from one of those Rust Belt diner interviews that the New York Times got so fond of printing for a while. Even so, the conflict in West Side Story has always been more about territory than about race. And this movie is very smart in how it recontextualizes that territorial conflict. The opening shot shows us that the neighborhood the Sharks and Jets are fighting over is doomed. It's earmarked for slum clearance to make room for Lincoln Center. This actually happened, by the way. Robert Moses bulldozed a neighborhood called San Juan Hill and displaced thousands of families, most of them African American and Puerto Rican, so they could build this bougie performing arts center on the Upper West Side. So this really underscores the futility of the fighting between the Sharks and the Jets. Yes, there's the old adage that fighting doesn't solve anything, but in this case, that's even more true, because the winner of this turf war will have their turf taken away by the city imminently. And instead of recognizing that they're both getting screwed over by the city catering to rich people, the Sharks and Jets instead take out their anger on each other in a truly meaningless fight. To again quote the Blank Check podcast, the thing that makes doing this movie today most potent is the thing that is still at the forefront of our cultural dialogue. The people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder all being taught to hate each other and fight each other in a way that they refuse to acknowledge the commonalities of their suffering, their shared experience, and instead are getting riled up by the people who could not have less to do with or understanding of their life. None of this context is in the original text because the original text wasn't a period piece. It's only with 60 years of hindsight can we reflect on the socioeconomic conditions that led to conflicts like this and interrogate what the real issue was. And if that interrogation is illuminating about how things still are, yeah, that's kind of the whole idea. There's a song late in the movie called Somewhere, and it is a melancholy but hopeful song about the belief that, quote, there is a place for us, there is a time for us. We'll find a new way of living, we'll find a way of forgiving, somehow, someday, somewhere. And that's kind of the whole show. West Side Story at its very core is about wanting to belong. It's what the Sharks want, it's what the Jets want, it's what Maria wants, it's what Anita wants, it's what Tony wants. To belong. Somewhere. In the 1961 movie, Tony sings Somewhere to Maria during a low point. And again, it's melancholy but hopeful. It's acknowledging that things are really tough right now, but maybe they won't always be if they can just find that somewhere. In the 2021 movie, Rita Moreno as Valentina sings Somewhere alone. Or really, she sings it to pictures of her late husband and to her own reflection. And when you take a step back and consider the contemporaneous issues of the day that the 1961 movie tackled, that Rita Moreno tackled as a young woman, and then consider those same issues are still relevant for a 2021 remake, and that this once young, now wrinkled woman is still living with these issues, the song becomes so crazily poignant. Giving this song to Valentina highlights the unfulfilled hope and optimism of the 57 show and 61 movie, and underscores how far we still have to go. We'll find a new way of living, we'll find a way of forgiving, somehow, someday, somewhere. Just one of many clever, thoughtful updates that made this new version of West Side Story, at least for this musical verse guy, easily one of the best movies of the year.